Carter Reed wanted nothing more than a quiet cup of coffee after a long repair shift, but Connor Blake, the neighborhood bully everyone tried to avoid, chose that exact moment to humiliate him near the counter. A sudden shove sent Carter's shoulder slamming into the stone counter, shattering a cup and sending a sharp gasp through the small shop. But before a heavy glass jar could fall onto the owner's head, Carter's hand moved faster than anyone could follow, and the whole room fell silent. Connor realized, too late, that he had just touched someone he never should have touched. If that one shove had been a mistake, the reflex that followed left the entire shop remembering the silence forever. Rain fell in a thin, steady drizzle over Cleveland that morning, the kind that softened every sound except the low hum of the coffee shop tucked between a hardware store and a shuttered bakery. The shop was not grand by any measure, just a narrow room with mismatched chairs, a chalkboard menu, and the comforting smell of roasted beans that clung to the walls like memory. Amelia Brooks had inherited the place from her parents, and though the espresso machine groaned with age and the floorboards creaked near the door, the regulars kept coming back for the warmth that money could not buy elsewhere. Carter Reed walked in just past 7, his jacket still carrying the faint smell of machine oil from a repair job that had stretched deep into the night. His eyes were tired but steady, the kind of tired that came from work rather than worry, though both lived in him in equal measure. He chose the same seat he always chose, a worn stool near the end of the counter, far enough from the door to avoid drafts and close enough to leave quickly if he needed to. He ordered black coffee, nothing else, and pulled a folded stack of invoices from his jacket pocket to review while he waited. He was a single father, though nothing in his posture announced it, and nothing in the scene needed to. He simply worked more hours than most men his age, took extra repair calls on weekends, and rarely complained about the weight of it. Amelia noticed him the moment he sat down and walked over with a small, grateful smile, thanking him for fixing her espresso machine the day before without charging her the full rate. Carter shrugged it off gently, saying the pressure valve only needed a temporary fix and would need full replacement before the month was out. Otherwise, it would fail when she least expected it. Madison Clark, wiping down the counter nearby, watched the exchange with quiet curiosity. She had noticed before that Carter was unfailingly polite, yet he kept a careful distance from everyone, as if politeness were a wall he had built rather than a warmth he freely gave. Logan Hayes, who ran the auto shop 2 doors down, pushed through the door a few minutes later, shaking rain from his cap and ordering his usual coffee with a teasing remark that Carter must not know how to sleep anymore, given how often he saw the man's truck parked outside the shop at odd hours. Carter only smiled faintly and said nothing in his own defense, which was typical of him. The mood in the shop that morning was unremarkable in the best way, ordinary in the way mornings are supposed to be, filled with the soft clatter of cups and the low murmur of regulars trading small talk about the weather and the price of gasoline. Beneath that ordinary surface, though, Amelia carried a weight she tried hard to hide. Carter overheard fragments of a phone call she took near the back room, something about a rent increase and a landlord who had grown suspiciously difficult to reach. He said nothing because it was not his business to pry into another person's troubles, and he respected the quiet dignity people tried to maintain even while struggling. Still, something in her voice stayed with him, a strain she was trying very hard to keep out of her smile. The morning rolled on calmly, customers drifting in and out, the rain tapping steadily on the window glass, until a black sport utility vehicle pulled up hard against the curb outside, splashing rainwater up against the front window. Madison's face went pale the instant she recognized the man stepping out of it, and the calm of the morning quietly began to end. Connor Blake stepped through the door with 2 of his men trailing behind him, dressed in clothes too expensive for the neighborhood and a manner too loud for the small room. He did not order anything right away. Instead, he walked straight to the counter and drummed his fingers against the stone surface as though he already owned the place and was merely deciding what to do with it. Amelia kept her composure, greeting him with the same professional tone she gave every customer, though her shoulders tensed the moment his shadow crossed the doorway. Connor reminded her, not for the first time, that she should consider selling before it was too late, because the neighborhood was changing fast and small people like her had no business standing in the way of progress. Amelia declined politely, telling him the shop had belonged to her family for 2 generations, and she had no intention of giving it up. Connor laughed under his breath, then deliberately knocked a stack of paper napkins off the counter and told Madison to pick them up, his voice dripping with a casual cruelty he clearly enjoyed. Madison bent down immediately, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered the scattered napkins. Carter watched from his stool but said nothing, understanding that an early reaction would only give Connor an excuse to escalate things further than they needed to go. Connor's attention drifted toward Carter, taking in the work jacket, the grease-stained sleeves, and the quiet posture of a man who clearly did not belong, in Connor's mind, to anyone important. He called Carter, the poor repairman, and asked, loud enough for the whole shop to hear, whether Amelia paid him in leftover coffee instead of real money. Logan, sitting nearby, started to rise from his seat, but Carter gave him the smallest shake of his head, a silent request to stay out of it. Carter only said, calmly, that he did not want any trouble that morning. That single sentence seemed to embolden Connor rather than discourage him, because men like Connor had built their entire lives around the assumption that people who avoided conflict were simply afraid of them. Connor stepped deliberately into Carter's path, brushing against his cup hard enough to spill coffee across the counter in a dark, spreading stain. Carter still did not raise his voice. He reached calmly for a napkin and wiped the spill in silence, his expression unreadable. Amelia, finally losing her patience, told Connor sharply that he needed to either order something or leave the shop immediately. Connor turned toward her, his voice dropping into something quieter and far more threatening, saying that a small shop like hers could have an accident at any time, the kind that nobody could predict or prevent. Carter lifted his eyes for the first time since Connor had walked in, his gaze calm but unmistakably sharp, like a blade resting flat on a table. Connor noticed the shift but underestimated what it meant, choosing instead to read it as one more form of harmless defiance from a man who worked with his hands and little else. He stepped closer still, close enough that his shadow fell completely over Carter's shoulder, and placed a hand down hard on it. With a thin, mocking smile, Connor leaned in and asked Carter who exactly he thought he was, his voice carrying just enough volume to make sure every customer in the shop could hear the question clearly. A few of the regulars near the window exchanged uneasy glances, the kind of silent communication people share when they sense trouble building but feel powerless to stop it. An older man sitting near the door quietly slid his chair backward, putting a little more distance between himself and whatever was about to unfold. Amelia's hands tightened around the rag she had been using to wipe the counter, her knuckles pale, though she kept her chin level and her eyes fixed on Connor rather than letting fear show through her posture. Even Madison, frozen near the napkin dispenser, found herself holding her breath without realizing it, waiting for whatever would happen next inside that small, suddenly tense room. Carter rose slowly from his stool, his hands open and relaxed at his sides, and told Connor, in a voice barely above conversational, that he should take his hand off his shoulder. Connor laughed loudly, clearly enjoying the small audience the shop had become, determined to humiliate Carter fully in front of Amelia and everyone watching. Without warning, he shoved Carter hard with both hands, sending him crashing backward into the stone counter behind him. Carter's shoulder struck the edge with a dull, heavy thud, and the cup he had been holding shattered against the floor, coffee splattering across the tile in dark streaks. The impact rattled the small shelf mounted behind the counter, and a heavy glass jar filled with whole coffee beans slid free from its edge, tumbling straight toward the spot where Amelia stood frozen in shock. Several people screamed at once. Madison stood paralyzed, unable to move. Amelia had no time to step away from where the jar was falling. Carter, despite having just been thrown into solid stone, twisted his body in a motion that seemed almost instinctive, faster than thought, faster than anyone in the room could process with their eyes. He caught the edge of a falling shard of glass with his forearm, pulled Amelia backward out of the jar's path with one hand, and caught the heavy glass jar itself with the other before it could shatter against the floor. The entire sequence happened in less than a single second, so quickly that nobody in the shop fully understood what they had just witnessed until it was already over. The room fell completely silent, the only sounds left being the rain outside and the soft hiss of the old espresso machine behind the counter. Connor took an unconscious half-step backward, feeling for the first time that morning a flicker of uncertainty he did not enjoy. Carter set the glass jar down gently on the counter, careful and unhurried, making no move to retaliate against Connor at all. He looked at Connor and said quietly that a man should think twice before shoving people around a room full of glass and innocent bystanders. His voice was not loud, but it carried a coldness that settled over the room and silenced whatever bravado remained in Connor's posture. One of Connor's men lunged forward suddenly, but Carter simply leaned aside, caught the man's wrist with his own, and redirected the momentum, causing him to lose his balance entirely and drop awkwardly into a nearby chair. Carter threw no punches and used no more force than the situation required, controlling the entire moment through reflex and minimal technique rather than aggression. Customers nearby began whispering among them, several agreeing quietly that this repairman was clearly not an ordinary man at all. Amelia looked at Carter with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief written plainly across her face. Connor, humiliated in front of his own men and half the shop, tried desperately to recover some sense of menace. He growled that Carter had just made a serious mistake, his voice shaking with anger he could not fully hide. Carter answered simply that the real mistake belonged to Connor, who had assumed everyone in that shop would keep being afraid of him forever. Connor stormed toward the door, But before stepping outside, he glanced up at the small security camera mounted near the ceiling and smiled with a coldness that promised the story was far from finished, that he intended to twist what had happened into something else entirely. A few hours later, a heavily edited clip began circulating through a local community group online, stripped of everything that mattered. The clip showed only the moment Carter caused Connor's man to fall awkwardly into a chair, cutting out entirely the shove that started everything and the falling glass jar that had nearly struck Amelia. Connor had paid someone to post it, framing the story as a violent repairman attacking an innocent customer inside a quiet neighborhood shop. Amelia was furious, but when she pulled up the shop's own security footage to prove otherwise, the recording for that exact stretch of time had somehow failed. Carter checked the system quickly and realized storage drives did not simply fail at the precise moment they were needed most. Someone had accessed it remotely or tampered directly with the shop's internal network, deliberately erasing the truth before it could be used against them. Amelia grew increasingly afraid, knowing that if the shop became known for violence, she could easily lose her business license over something she never caused. Jason Miller arrived not long after to ask questions, careful to note that he was not arresting anyone yet, but that Connor had already filed a formal complaint against Carter. Carter cooperated calmly, answering every question honestly without revealing anything about his past or the skills that had saved Amelia from serious harm. Elizabeth Monroe, a lawyer and regular customer who had witnessed the entire incident from her usual table, offered to serve as a witness if the matter ever reached a courtroom. Still, Connor had clearly prepared in advance. A handful of strangers who had been sitting in the shop that morning later claimed, falsely, that Carter had struck first without provocation, repeating words that sounded suspiciously rehearsed and identical to one another. Carter understood almost immediately that this was not a spontaneous outburst of bullying but something far more calculated, a deliberate plan aimed at pushing Amelia out of her own shop entirely. Logan revealed quietly that Connor had threatened several other shop owners along the same block over the past year, pressuring them into selling their properties for far less than they were worth. Amelia finally admitted that she had received 3 separate offers to buy the shop within the last 2 months, all of them arriving through the same unfamiliar intermediary company with no clear face behind it. Carter made no grand promises about rescuing her single-handedly. He told her simply that the truth required real evidence, not raised voices or public outrage, and that evidence took patience to find and assemble properly. Late that evening, after most customers had gone and Amelia had locked the front door, Carter examined the shop's small networking equipment more closely than before. Tucked behind the router, almost invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look, he found a small wireless transmission device that had clearly been planted there on purpose, something far too sophisticated for an ordinary local troublemaker to think of installing himself. Carter removed the strange device from behind the router and studied it carefully, recognizing it instantly as an expensive piece of remote access equipment, certainly not something an ordinary local bully would know how to obtain or operate. Amelia asked, with quiet disbelief, why a man who repaired coffee machines and cooling systems would understand network security hardware so precisely. Carter deflected the question gently, saying only that he had repaired many different kinds of systems over the years, leaving the rest unspoken. Elizabeth, sharp enough to notice the careful evasion, chose not to press him further on the matter. Carter managed to recover a fragment of footage from the camera's local memory by tracing a temporary backup file the tampering had failed to fully erase. The recovered frames were blurry, but showed Connor shoving him first, though not with enough clarity yet to stand as definitive proof in front of anyone official. Madison confessed quietly that she had once seen Connor hand cash to an unfamiliar man in exchange for information about Amelia's weekly schedule, something she had been too frightened to mention before that moment. Carter asked her gently not to confront Connor directly, explaining that he wanted Connor to feel safe enough to make a real mistake of his own. Carter walked over to Logan's auto shop next door to ask about the street cameras mounted outside his garage. Logan admitted his own cameras had lost signal during that exact stretch of time as well, a coincidence far too precise to be accidental. Carter studied the power lines, the blind spots in coverage, the position where Connor's vehicle had been parked, and slowly understood how carefully the entire setup had been planned in advance. A brief memory surfaced in his mind, unbidden, of years spent training to read a room during moments of crisis, noting exits, falling objects, the position of an opponent's hands, the angle of every camera, the smallest reflection in glass or metal. He did not dwell on the memory long, revealing only enough to satisfy curiosity without spelling out the entire shape of his past. He remembered, briefly, the reason he had walked away from that earlier life altogether, a failed assignment overseas that left an innocent person injured because of a single delayed decision, after which he swore never again to use his training for aggression of any kind. That memory explained, at least to himself, why he had only ever defended inside the shop and never once struck first, no matter how far Connor pushed him. Amelia looked at Carter with a new and steadier kind of trust forming behind her eyes. She told him she did not need him to fight on her behalf, only that she needed the truth to remain whole instead of being twisted into something unrecognizable by people determined to bend it. Carter answered quietly that the truth was already there, waiting, and that all they needed was the right vantage point to finally see it clearly. As he turned toward the front window of the shop, he noticed, almost by accident, the faint reflection of the auto shop's glass across the street, and realized it might have captured the entire shove from an angle nobody had considered. Connor realized Carter was quietly investigating him, and rather than backing off, he shifted his focus toward personal intimidation instead. He had someone follow Carter after work hours, photographing his old work truck and sending anonymous messages warning him to stay away from Amelia's shop entirely. Carter remained calm on the surface, but something in his eyes grew heavier, a clear sign that Connor had now crossed a line that mattered far more to him than property or pride. The story makes only the lightest mention that Carter had a small family depending on him, never describing them directly or placing them inside any scene. Carter adjusted his routine slightly after that, checking locks more carefully and staying alert without ever slipping into panic or paranoia. Connor kept pressing Amelia from every direction he could manage, sending a health inspector to the shop unannounced, filing a false report claiming violence on the premises, and quietly discouraging regular customers from continuing to visit. Amelia felt herself nearing a breaking point as the shop's income dropped sharply within just a few difficult days. Madison considered quitting out of fear, though Amelia never once blamed her for wanting to walk away from the pressure. Carter returned to the shop one evening after closing hours specifically to repair the damaged security system free of charge. Amelia asked him quietly why he kept helping so much, when none of this trouble belonged to him in the first place. Carter told her that certain small places held the dignity of an entire neighborhood together, and that if a place like hers were taken by someone cruel, everyone nearby would slowly learn to lower their heads in fear without even realizing it had happened to them. The moment between them carried real warmth, though nothing romantic needed to be spoken aloud yet, only a growing foundation of respect and quiet trust. Elizabeth, reviewing property records on her own time, discovered that the intermediary company attempting to buy the shop was connected to a much larger real estate development project sweeping through the neighborhood. Whoever truly owned that project remained hidden behind layers of paperwork, though it seemed increasingly likely that this unnamed owner stood directly behind Connor's actions all along. Carter absorbed this information calmly, understanding now that Connor was merely a visible hand attached to a much larger and more careful operation working from somewhere out of sight. That night, Connor appeared outside the locked shop after closing hours, slamming his palm flat against the glass and telling Carter through the window that next time would involve far more than a single shove. Carter stood near the counter and watched Connor through the rain-streaked glass without flinching, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. After Connor finally drove away, Carter walked the perimeter of the shop slowly, checking the back door, the alley gate, and the small window above the storage room, making certain everything was secure before he allowed himself to leave for the night. He thought briefly about calling Jason, then decided against it, knowing a threat alone would not hold up as evidence and might only warn Connor to be more careful about covering his tracks going forward. Driving home through the empty streets, Carter found himself thinking less about his own safety and more about how much weight Amelia had been carrying quietly, day after day, without ever once asking anyone else to share the burden. Carter predicted that Connor would eventually return to manufacture a real act of violence, hoping it would finally cost Amelia her business license once and for all. He convinced her to open the shop as usual, but to quietly install several new cameras around the room, including one small unit angled deliberately toward the reflective glass near the back wall. Elizabeth arranged for a handful of trustworthy regulars to be present that day, including Logan and a local journalist named Hannah Price, both ready to observe everything without drawing attention to themselves. Jason Miller was informed in advance as well, though Carter asked him not to intervene too early, wanting Connor to expose himself fully and naturally instead of being warned off prematurely. Connor walked into the shop during a busy morning rush, putting on a friendly mask while needling Carter with constant, quiet provocations meant to break his composure. He mocked Carter's job, his situation as a single father, and the silence he always carried like armor, clearly hoping to finally provoke some visible anger from him. Carter kept his voice level throughout, asking only that Connor either order something or leave the premises entirely. Growing impatient, Connor deliberately knocked a cup of hot coffee toward Madison as she walked past with a tray of dishes. Carter reacted instantly, sliding a metal serving tray sideways to intercept the spilling liquid, sending it harmlessly onto the floor instead of onto Madison's skin. Once again, the entire shop witnessed a level of reflex that seemed almost impossible for an ordinary repairman to possess. Furious that Carter continued only defending rather than retaliating, Connor smashed a glass cup deliberately against the counter, intending to blame the damage on Carter afterward. Carter remained calm, simply pointing toward the ceiling and mentioning quietly that there was more than one camera watching the room this time. Connor froze for a moment, unaware that the most important camera of all was actually angled toward the reflective glass behind him rather than anything obvious overhead. One of Connor's men quietly drew a small folding blade, not intending to seriously injure anyone but hoping to create enough chaos to shift attention elsewhere. Carter spotted the motion through the polished reflection on a steel coffee container nearby, stepped half a pace forward, wrapped a cloth around the man's wrist, and knocked the blade harmlessly to the floor without causing any serious injury at all. Everyone in the shop saw clearly that Connor had brought an armed man into a public space full of innocent people. Jason walked in at precisely that moment, ordering everyone present to remain exactly where they stood. Connor shouted that Carter had set a trap for him, his voice rising with desperation. Carter answered evenly that nobody had trapped him at all, that he had simply been recorded behaving exactly as he truly was underneath the expensive clothes and the false friendliness. Jason confiscated the blade carefully, though Connor still managed to look strangely confident, clearly trusting that whoever stood behind him held enough power to make the entire mess disappear quietly, the way such problems always seem to disappear for men like him. After the incident, Carter's name began spreading quietly through the neighborhood, some calling him a hero, though he clearly disliked the attention that came with the word. Hannah Price wanted a full interview, but Carter politely declined every single request she made. Determined anyway, she dug into his background and discovered a public record connecting him to an international security firm that had once employed him many years earlier. An old article mentioned a hostage rescue overseas, describing how Carter had noticed an unusual detail through pure reflex and observation that ultimately exposed a hidden explosive device before anyone else even understood the danger surrounding them. Hannah chose not to publish anything immediately, sensing that Carter had real reasons for wanting that earlier chapter of his life to remain buried quietly. Amelia learned a small piece of the story by accident and asked Carter directly whether he had once been a very different kind of man entirely. Carter did not deny it. He told her simply that he had once lived inside a world where a single second of hesitation could cost an innocent person their life, and that he eventually walked away from that world because he refused to let himself become someone who only knew how to react to danger. Amelia finally understood why Carter held himself with such constant restraint. His real strength, she realized, was never about the speed of his reflexes at all, but rather about his choice not to destroy Connor completely even when he clearly had every opportunity to do so. Elizabeth uncovered that the company quietly backing Connor was called Blake Urban Holdings, in which Connor himself held a hidden ownership stake through a close relative listed on the paperwork. This single discovery proved that Connor was not merely acting as someone else's hired hand, but stood to profit directly if Amelia's shop were forced into a cheap, hurried sale. Jason began quietly investigating other small business owners along the same street who had previously been pressured into selling their properties under similar circumstances. Logan provided a short list of 4 shop owners who had left the area entirely after receiving threats nearly identical to the ones Amelia had endured. Carter understood that proving the shove inside the shop was no longer enough on its own, and that they needed undeniable evidence pointing directly toward a much larger pattern of coercion stretching across the entire block. That same week, Connor sent Amelia a final purchase agreement along with a message warning that if she failed to sign it before Friday, the shop would disappear in a far worse way than anyone could imagine. Carter spent that evening reading through the small list Logan had given him, recognizing several of the names from old delivery receipts and repair tickets stretching back years. One shop had sold appliances, another had repaired bicycles, and a third had run a small bakery that closed so suddenly that nobody in the neighborhood ever learned the real reason behind it. Seeing the pattern laid plainly on paper made something settle firmly inside Carter, a quiet certainty that this fight had stopped being only about one coffee shop a long time ago. He folded the list carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket, deciding that whatever happened next, he would not let Amelia face the coming days without someone steady standing beside her. Amelia nearly considered giving up entirely, exhausted by weeks of dwindling customers, mounting bills, and the steady erosion of her shop's reputation. Carter arrived one evening after closing and found her sitting on behind the counter, the purchase agreement lying unsigned in front of her under the dim overhead light. She admitted quietly that holding on to the shop might simply be stubbornness dressed up as principle, nothing more meaningful than that. Carter offered no hollow comfort. Instead, he told her that after leaving his earlier career, he too had once believed that living quietly meant staying out of everyone else's troubles entirely. He explained that he eventually understood silence in the face of wrongdoing only convinced cruel people that the entire world belonged to them alone. Amelia asked whether he ever felt afraid through any of this. Carter admitted that he felt afraid nearly every single day, but that fear alone was never a good enough reason to lower one's head. Elizabeth called that same evening to explain that if they could prove Connor had used threats to force a sale, both the unsigned agreement and the earlier offers might serve as solid evidence of commercial extortion under the law. Carter proposed a plan. Amelia would agree to meet Connor and pretend to seriously consider signing, while Elizabeth, Jason, and Hannah quietly prepared to document everything in a way that would hold up legally after. Amelia hesitated, worried that Connor might lose control of himself entirely once he realized he was being recorded. Carter promised he would remain present throughout, but that he would only step in if someone's safety were truly at risk, nothing more and nothing less. Logan offered to lend a small dashboard camera from one of his service vehicles, positioning it to cover the narrow alley behind the shop. Madison, despite her fear, decided she would stay and serve as a witness rather than walk away from the people who had stood beside her. This marked a quiet turning point in spirit, as the people who had once stayed silent out of fear slowly began standing together instead. Carter spent a few final minutes alone inside the shop that night, walking over to the stone counter where everything had first begun. He placed his hand gently against a small crack left behind from that very first impact, as though remembering just for a moment exactly how far they had all come since that ordinary rainy morning. Connor arrived at the shop on Friday evening, fully convinced that Amelia had finally been pushed to the edge of surrender. He dressed more formally than usual, accompanied by a man posing as a business consultant rather than what he truly was. Amelia placed the purchase agreement on the table but left it unsigned, her hand steady despite the fear coiled tightly inside her chest. Connor spoke in a sweet condescending tone, telling her she should have understood her situation much sooner than this. Carter stood quietly behind the counter, dressed in his usual work jacket, saying nothing at all for the moment. Connor mocked him, saying the so-called hero of the coffee shop now only knew how to pour drinks for other people. Carter did not react to the insult, instead watching Connor's hands carefully, along with his phone, the back exit, and the unfamiliar man standing close beside him. Amelia asked directly whether Connor had been behind the destroyed camera footage, the false health inspection report, and the ongoing threats against other shop owners nearby. Connor smiled but did not confirm anything outright, enjoying the moment of perceived control far too much to give it up easily. Amelia pretended to tremble slightly, saying she only wanted assurance that everyone would finally be left alone once she signed the agreement in front of him. Connor, growing careless, said that people like her only ever learned their lesson, once pushed right to the very edge of ruin. He casually mentioned the other shop owners along the block, saying they had all eventually learned their own lessons as well, the words slipping out of him without much thought at all. Elizabeth listened through a small legal recording device hidden in Amelia's bag, while Jason waited nearby, having already gathered enough cause to act the moment things turned dangerous. The man accompanying Connor suddenly sensed something was wrong and reached forward to grab Amelia's bag from her shoulder. Carter moved instantly, catching the man's wrist in a controlled grip that caused no real injury at all. Connor exploded with anger, snatching the heavy coffee pot off its warmer and hurling it toward Carter, though its path would have struck Amelia squarely instead. Carter reacted within a fraction of a second, pulling Amelia clear of the throw, sweeping a metal tray upward to intercept the pot, and twisting the force of the impact so the pot landed harmlessly in the sink rather than shattering across the floor. The moment echoed the very first scene from that rainy morning weeks earlier, proving once again that Carter chose protection over violence every single time it mattered most. Connor lunged forward with a wild punch. Carter stepped smoothly aside, allowing Connor's own momentum to carry him off balance and send him stumbling hard into a nearby chair. This time, every camera angle in the room captured the moment with perfect clarity. Jason entered with backup officers close behind, ordering Connor to remain exactly where he stood without resisting any further. Connor screamed that Carter had struck him first, but the live footage from every angle clearly showed Carter only avoiding danger and protecting people around him. Hannah arrived shortly after, announcing publicly that several other shop owners along the block had already agreed to come forward as witnesses against Connor's earlier threats. Elizabeth confirmed that the recorded threats from that very evening were more than enough to open a full investigation into coercion, property damage, false reporting, and a coordinated scheme to seize multiple properties through fear rather than fair dealing. Connor, for the first time since the entire ordeal began, looked genuinely afraid. He turned toward Carter and asked, almost helplessly, exactly who he really was beneath everything. Carter answered calmly that he was simply a man who had grown tired of watching the strong shove other people into counters and call it nothing more than ordinary business. Outside, as officers escorted Connor toward a waiting vehicle, a small crowd of regular customers gathered along the sidewalk and applauded quietly, not with noise or spectacle, but with the simple, quiet relief of people who finally felt safe again inside their own neighborhood. Several weeks later, Amelia's shop reopened to a steadier and busier crowd than it had ever known before everything happened. The complete unedited footage eventually circulated widely as well, and this time Carter was not portrayed as a violent man at all, but as someone who had protected an innocent person and exposed a careful scheme aimed at destroying a small, honest business. Amelia never sold the shop. With Elizabeth's continued legal help, she pursued a countersuit against Connor's company and successfully secured her long-term lease for years to come. Madison carried herself with newfound confidence, no longer lowering her eyes whenever a rude customer raised their voice toward her. Logan repaired and repainted the shop's outdoor sign for free, calling it a small gift from the neighborhood that had nearly lost something precious. Jason confirmed that Connor now faced several serious charges, and that other shop owners who had once been forced into selling under pressure finally had the chance to reopen their old cases as well. Carter continued declining any deeper interview about his earlier life, preferring instead to remain exactly as ordinary as he had always tried to be. Hannah eventually published an article that focused entirely on the community rather than on Carter's private history. She described him simply as a man whose reflexes moved faster than most people could follow, yet whose heart moved even faster whenever an innocent person needed protecting. Amelia thanked Carter warmly, not only for saving her from real harm, but for helping her remember that the shop had always been worth defending in the first place. Carter answered quietly that she was the one who had kept the shop standing through everything, and that he had simply happened to be present on the one day someone chose the wrong target entirely. A small detail quietly reminded everyone of his life outside the shop. Carter received a short family phone call one afternoon, smiled softly at whatever was said on the other end, and slipped the phone back into his pocket without another word. No child appeared in the scene at all, keeping his life exactly as grounded and ordinary as it had always been, never turning him into some distant, larger-than-life figure. Amelia placed a fresh cup of black coffee in front of Carter one quiet morning, telling him plainly that this particular cup would not appear on any bill. Carter started to politely refuse, but she stopped him gently, explaining that this was not repayment for anything, simply something offered to a trusted regular. The story closes with Carter seated on the very same stool near the counter where everything first began weeks earlier, except now the shop felt calm, the light felt warm, and nobody inside carried even a trace of fear anymore. Connor had once believed a single shove might be enough to bring Carter down completely, yet that very same shove ended up helping an entire neighborhood finally learn how to stand tall again. There was a simple lesson sitting quietly beneath everything that had happened inside that small coffee shop in Cleveland. Silence should never be mistaken for weakness, and kindness should never be mistaken for an invitation to be trampled by people who only respect strength when it is loud and obvious. Some people never feel the need to display power openly, because they understand that real strength always travels hand in hand with control, never with cruelty or carelessness. Carter Reed never set out to prove anything to anyone that morning. He simply refused to let fear decide how he treated the people standing near him. The story leaves behind a few lasting images worth holding on to. A sudden shove against a stone counter, a heavy glass jar falling toward someone who never deserved harm. A reflex built not from anger but from years of learning how to protect rather than destroy. And finally, the truth itself, captured patiently from angles that a cruel man never thought to consider until it was already too late for him to hide behind lies any longer. Good people do not need to abandon their gentleness in order to win. They only need patience, clear eyes, and the quiet courage to keep standing exactly where they belong, even when someone far louder tries to push them aside. If this story left a lasting impression, consider sharing your own thoughts on what you might have done standing in Amelia's place that morning. Would you have found the courage to face someone like Connor directly, trusting that the truth would eventually stand beside you? Stories like Carter's are a reminder that ordinary people, working quietly in ordinary places, sometimes carry extraordinary courage inside them, waiting patiently for the one moment that finally calls it forward.